Greetings, bibliophiles, and welcome back to The Book Thing, where today I'm looking at an author who I'm a really long time fan of, but just haven't covered on the channel before. And the book in question is a little bit special too. Now, the author is Terry Pratchett, and the book is The Shepherd's Crown, which is his final published novel. And the reason why it's a little bit special, it's not just that it's his final published novel before he died, or was it published after he died? I can't actually remember now. But I have had this sat on my shelf for like a year and a half, and I've been putting off reading it for a year and a half because it's the last ever Terry Pratchett novel, and after I'd read this, then there'd be no new Terry Pratchett for me to read. So it might sound like a bit of a daft reason, but it sort of made sense in my head. But I've gotten to the point where I thought I'd better read it, because otherwise it's just sat there being, ornamental. And there's no point in an ornamental book. Books are there to be read, and having one that just sits around and never gets read is it's a waste. So, especially considering that it's a Discworld novel, just leaving it there unread would have doubly been a waste. So I finally knuckled down and I read it, and it was worth it. It is very good. There is actually an interesting postscript by I think it's his editor, I'm not sure. Rob Wilkins is the name given anyway, where he explains that, it's a complete novel and it's his final completed novel. But if Terry Pratchett had actually lived a bit longer and been able to work on it for longer, he probably would have. We probably would have had a slightly different looking story, because he's the kind of author that you had to prize the manuscript from his hand pretty much, that he wanted to keep tinkering away and working and reworking and just making sure that it was as good as it could be. So the actual novel itself is it's unrecognizably, unquestionably and recognisably Terry Pratchett's work, but it's maybe a tiny bit rougher in some regards than some of his other work. But having said that, it's still a really good story, and it's still up there with some of the better or even the best Discworld stories. Some of his, there's just a couple where they fell a bit flat, and you'll forgive me if I digress and wander off into talking about the Discworld generally at times, because this is my first time covering Pratchett on the channel. But no, this one was very, very well constructed, and it's almost fitting in a way that this is the final Discworld novel. I mean, I don't know if he knew it was going to be the final one, but the themes that are actually contained within it, they're quite fitting in a way. It's not quite a goodbye from Terry, but there's bits of it where it almost feels like it's him passing on to how to put this exactly. I don't really want to, there's a specific thing I could say which would be a massive spoiler, even though it does occur relatively early in the book. But it's kind of cyclical, I'll put it that way. It's about things ending, but also about things beginning and life going on. That's a really major theme of this book. So this is why I think it's fitting in a way, because, life goes on. So the book itself, well, it's one of the Tiffany Aching novels. The Discworld books, if you are unaware, you can basically group them by the characters that appear in them. And she's a more recent character. I mean, having said that, not every book had characters that then turned up in later books. There were some that were one-offs in that regard, but broadly speaking, you've got the Witches of Lancre, and then you've got Rincewind, and then you've got the City Watch in Ankh-Morpork, and latterly you had Moist von Lipwig turning up as well as a recurring character. I think he had 2 books, or was it 3? I can't remember. But anyway, the Tiffany Aching books, there's 4 of these, including this last one, and they were aimed at a more younger audience, and the language is a little bit different in these than you might find in some of his other sort of more aimed at adults books, but it's still a really good story. He doesn't dumb down the characters, he doesn't dumb down the story, he doesn't try and he's not pandering to anybody. It's just he uses slightly different language, I would say, than he might have done if he'd been aiming at an adult audience even specifically. So, apart from that, it is very, very recognisably a Terry Pratchett book, and it's pretty good stuff. And it brings in some old characters, and Tiffany's a character we've had in a couple of other novels, as I've said, and it's also bringing in locations that we've had before, but that haven't been in the same book before. And it's interesting to see the contrast between them almost. So what it's about, briefly, is elves. And Tiffany has to deal with the elves. And you might think, oh, elves sound, quite nice. But this is the Discworld. And one of the things that Pratchett did specifically with the Discworld, it started off with the first two novels being pretty much just a fantasy pastiche, taking all the tropes of the genre and using them to comic effect. But the magic of the Discworld didn't really come until, I think, arguably sort of novels 3 to 5. Like Guards, which I think is the third novel. Like, that's where it starts to pick up a life of its own. Guards, well, that's the 8th novel, apparently. What's the third? Equal Rights. Mort, the 4th novel, I would argue, is where it starts to really become its own thing, where it becomes more of a living, breathing world in its own right, and not just, here's a bunch of fantasy tropes that I've turned on their head. So that's the kind of thing that he does, and he brings in a lot of real world mythology and history and like stories from all over the place. And so you've got the Discworld itself, which is a flat, round world that rides through space on the back of a turtle. And this actually comes from, I can't even remember the actual mythology now, but it's a thing that, has been put down somewhere as a theory of how the world gets around, and then occasionally you get jokes about how it's turtles all the way down when they try to discuss, well, what's beneath the greater Tuin, the turtle on which the world rides. So there's all kinds of stuff like that. Like he was the kind of guy that just collected stuff in his brain like lint, and he had all these little things tucked away in the nooks and crannies of his mind, and used them to absolutely great effect in his stories. And the elves, as they are in the Discworld, go back to some of the older depictions where elves are not nice creatures. They're capricious and tricksters, and just they do things for their own amusement, even if it involves hurting other creatures. And that is exactly what they are in this book and in the other appearances that they've made in the Discworld. And so Tiffany basically has to find herself, or she finds herself in the position where it's up to her to do something about this, but not just her. It also brings other witches into it, and other characters, and you get a nice little sense of how the witches operate as a kind of not a society exactly, but a hierarchy, maybe, I don't know. So yeah, all in all, it's a pretty good book, and I'm not sure it's one I could particularly say, start with this if you're new to the Discworld, but then there's a huge amount of debate as to where you should start somebody with the Discworld. So I'm coming to this as somebody who's basically read, pretty much all the other Discworld novels, plus I think pretty much every other novel that Pratchett wrote. I'm just actually checking this. Yeah, he co-authored... I haven't read some of the ones he co-authored with Stephen Baxter, but I think I've read all the ones that he wrote himself. And then I've read a couple of the the things he co-wrote with other people, like the Science of the Discworld books. And I've actually got one of the maps on my shelf as well. It's like a map of Ankh-Morpork. You know, it developed to that stage where you can go and buy a map of the Discworld or a map of Ankh-Morpork. It has been that well developed and that well mapped out, and it's that cohesive. This is why it's really taken on such a life of its own, because it feels like an actual place. And it's kind of wonderful and magical and weird, and yet all at the same time, it's still, at its heart, is a reflecting mirror on our own world, on our own selves, because there's so much of our own world that's gone into it. So I'm not going to say, oh, you must go out and buy this, and I highly recommend it. I do highly recommend it, but starting with something else to actually get a handle on the Discworld, I think would be more recommended if you've never read a Discworld novel. And if you've just never read Terry Pratchett generally, you might even want to start with, I don't even know, something else. Because he did write a couple of other novels. You know, he wrote some other novels for young adults that, I mean, if you're in the UK, you might have heard of Truckers, Diggers and Wings, because that was adapted for TV, I think. And I think the BBC also did the Johnny trilogy, Only You Can Save Mankind, Johnny the Dead, and Johnny and the Bomb. But Nation, maybe. I think if I was going to start somebody off with Terry Pratchett generally, I'd maybe point them to Nation, which is one of his few non-Discworld... I mean, it's not even really fantasy-esque, but it's kind of... It's not quite our history, but it's almost our history. And it's possibly one of his best books. There's a lot of very good Discworld books, but I think Nation really does stand out. So I'll read a little excerpt for you from... this is chapter 5, which is called A Changing World. The Queen of the Elves sat in state on a diamond throne in her palace, surrounded by her courtiers, foundlings and lost boys, and creeping creatures with no names, all the detritus of the fairy folk. She had chosen to sparkle today. The everlasting sunlight shining through the exquisitely carved stone windows had been pitched exactly to strike the tiny gems on her wings, so that delicate rainbows of light danced around the audience chamber as she moved. The courtiers lounging about the place in lace-trimmed velvet and feathers were almost, but not quite, as beautifully dressed. Her eyes slid sideways, ever alert to the actions of her lords and ladies. Was that Lord Lankin over there in the corner with Lord Mustardseed? Whispering. And where was Lord Peaseblossom? One day, she thought, she would have his head on a pole. She didn't trust him at all, and his glamour had been strong of late, almost as glorious as her own, or, she reminded herself bitterly, as glorious as her own before. Before that young witch, Tiffany Aching, had come into fairyland and humiliated her. Lately, she had felt shivers between their two worlds, understood that things were shifting, the edges were becoming more blurred, softer. A few of the stronger elves had even been slipping through from time to time for a little mischief. Perhaps soon she should lead the elves on a proper raiding party, fetch another child to play with, have her revenge on the Aching witch. The queen smiled at the thought, licking her lips in anticipation of the fun ahead. But for now there was other troubling news to deal with. Goblins! Mere worms who should be grateful if an elvish lord or lady even looked their way, but who were now foolishly refusing to do her bidding. She would show them all, she thought. Lords Lankin, Mustardseed, Peaseblossom, they would see how powerful she was again. They would see her strike down this goblin filth. But where was Peaseblossom? So, yeah, the elves, they're not nice. They're not nice at all. And basically, they are kind of an anachronism. You know, they're kind of the elves that would go and steal babies and just cause trouble and just be generally awful for the sake of being awful. And it almost, like, there's been this trend towards the latter novels of, I don't want to call it modernization exactly, but a shift in the ways of the Discworld, almost a kind of coming of an age of industrialization, if I can put it that way, maybe. Yeah, kind of like the shift in Britain from the kind of pre-industrial society in the 17th century to the then massive shifts that happened through the process of industrialization and technology really taking off and just changing the face of society. So, in the midst of all of that is this completely anachronistic society of elves who basically live in their own plane and like to slip through from time to time. And it's almost like this is another way in which it's almost fitting that this is the final Discworld novel, because it's kind of like the final thing of having to deal with the elves, this unpleasant blast from the past, if I can put it that way. And it's an ending in that regard for that particular kind of story, I guess, because the elves have popped up in other Discworld novels, not as a major thing. There's one Discworld novel in particular where they do pop up as a major thing, and there are probably other times when they've been mentioned, but I don't know, it's fitting somehow that it should be a book about ends and beginnings, considering that it was, of course, his last novel. So I'm not quite sure how to wrap this one up, honestly. If you thought this sounded interesting, go and read Pratchett, go and read Nation, go and read some of the early Discworld novels and see if it grabs you. I think Guards is a particularly good one to start with myself. The Rincewind, the first two books, the Rincewind novels, The Colour of Magic and The Light Fantastic, they're fun. They're fun, but it doesn't really give you a flavour of the Discworld as it becomes. And I think, Guards is where that happens. But some of the earlier ones, Weird Sisters and Pyramids, Sorcery, they're all pretty good. And by the time you get to the likes of Small Gods, Men at Arms, Interesting Times, the Discworld really is starting to feel like a fully fledged place. And the really good news for you, if you've never read any Pratchett before, is that of just the Discworld novels alone, there's 41 of them. So you're not going to be running short anytime soon. So hopefully you have found this kind of review. I mean, it wasn't really a proper review in the way I've done some of the other ones, but I've kind of struggled to know what to say about this particular book without delving into the Discworld in particular. But hopefully you've found it interesting anyway, and if it gets you to go and pick up some Terry Pratchett from your local library, then my job here is done. So if you have enjoyed it, you can leave any comments below, you can hit the like button, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.